Thank you all for joining us this morning. Our first panel discussion is on the residential transformations of three iconic post-World War II modernist houses and their relationship to the landscape. MoMA is a fitting gathering place to discuss the continued relevance and legacy of modernism, as MoMA was, of course, an early advocate and promulgator of modernism in art, design, landscape, and architecture. We would also, of course, be remiss to not mention that the patron saint of MoMA, Phillip Johnson, who has contributed much to the cultural landscape of New York City and to American modernism more generally. This introduction will be all too brief. Brief because Charles says it has to be so. But more importantly, because it also aligns with the kind of open-ended, neo-vitalistic thinking, which I would like to stress as emerging anew in mid-century modern thought and culture. I hope to give us a kind of an experience of modern thought rather than a definitive and closed history. It is meant to be a kind of provocation or environmental trigger where an active listenership can then continue their own lines of thoughts. This kind of experimental and experiential thinking I take to be the very foundation of science and modernism. It is open, non-dogmatic, and deeply aware of the plurality and dynamic nature of truth. My overarching theme here is to leap from the physical to the biological and much architectural discourse of the 1940s and 50s. Richard Neutra's 1951 Mysteries and Realities of the Site leap to mind, but also on the other end of the spectrum does the legendary 1940 MoMA organic design in home furnishings competition organized by Elliott Noyes. And a bit later, The Powers of 10 film by Charles and Ray Ames. What emerges is a neo-organicism and systems thinking model of nature and human nature as a complex set of overlapping biotechnological and biosocial networks. Even more significant, there is an increased focus on nature as constantly changing, evolving, and transforming. Dynamism as the base state of nature, evolution, life sciences, along with the rejection of the mechanical, simple motion of one-dimensional cause and effect change, is increasingly replaced here by the open, soft systems of bidimensional motion of circular processes. What I'm interested in demonstrating is the contrast between one of Moholy-Nagy's early mechanical light motion devices and Kepish's later work on the expanded notion and integration of technology, art, and environment at a civic scale through interactive components that transform the passive viewer into an active participant. In other words, experiential architecture where media was geared to all sensory apparatus. The electric prop of electric stage, Moholy-Nagy's kinetic sculpture that represented the start of the union of art, a startling union of art and technology when it was first introduced at an exhibition in Paris in 1930. Powered by an electric motor with a circular opening cut into one side, the light props of perforated disc screens slowly revolve, casting shifting lights and patterns and colors on the rear wall of the box. Moholy-Nagy at the time suggested that the rear wall could be removed, allow the shadowy patterns to lay on the walls and ceilings. By contrast, the new landscape at MIT in 1951 by Grigory Kepish and his 1957 book, The New Landscape in Art and Science, called for a shift from object-oriented vision to pattern-oriented vision. This shift away from the object and onto the field also represents the shift from the physical object, the industrial product, and its mechanical and assembly logics, to the larger environment, the landscape, in which these objects act as forces and dynamic packets of energy in the new biological model of nature. Behind all of these works is an acute interest in the moving image, the dynamic interpretive structure of perception itself, and of all natural and biological systems as dynamic and changing. Kepish deploys the advanced technological tools and instruments used by scientists to expand upon the visible range of human perception. He did not picture natural phenomena as much as mapped nature as a dynamic system of patterns. What also emerges is a relational and situational aesthetic that now displaces the early material and functional aesthetic of the industrial modern. In the language of vision, 1944, Kepish defines dynamic pattern-oriented perception and recognition as a kind of experiential transparency or activity. In other words, transparency is a dynamic structure of cognitive perceptual activity, a rhythmic coexistence of radically heterogeneous and temporally dispersed elements which, instead of holding together the contents of the perceived world, seek to enter into a ceaseless movement of destabilization. Here, vision is active, disjunctive, event replaces stasis. Oops. In this sense, phenomenal transparency for Kepesh and others serves as a heuristic tool that holds these contradictions together in opposition to what the dominant line of Western thinking that insists on drawing them apart. Inside this elegant and graphically intricate multimedia and dimensional pattern book is a surprising essay by the philosopher-architect Richard Neutra titled Inner and Outer Landscape. Neutra's musings are worth repeating. He begins, "Architecture is not only a response to the landscape, but a very physical insert into it. The new landscape reaches into vastness and smallness beyond the normal sensory range. Above all, it reaches into our own innermost physiology, the processes within our skins, within our organism, our nervous system. There is a multiplicity of urges and aspirations which the architect must serve while modify the scene around humans. Freedom on the one hand, inaccessibility, protection, privacy on the other. Opaque screens, impenetrable to the senses, fences, filters, enclosures are the most subtle things which the connoisseur of biological problems turned designer will ever so often have to insert into the continuous landscape of organic events. He must do it without fundamentally disturbing its vital currents," end of quote. Many of us here today had the unique pleasure of experiencing the Kaufman House in Palm Springs and its profound relationship to the landscape firsthand. For those who were there, little needs to be said. The direct experience is the meaning of Neutra's work and words. To invoke John Dewey, here we have art as experience and experience as education. The profound sensitivity to both the domestic and natural dimensions of the landscape cannot be represented. But for sake of conversation, what I would note is what makes this building so profound and sensitive for me is that it defers itself to its near and far landscapes in a way which cannot help but question the claim that the house is a machine in the desert. If it is a machine, it's more a musical instrument, a heuristic device that helps tune us into the larger environment and landscape of which it and we are only a small part. Uh-oh. Thanks. There is much more to say about Neutra with respect to both the psychologizing and ecologizing of modernism, but there is no space or time here. Charles. In contrast to the Bauhaus ideal of the beautiful, formal, functional, well-made object, the Aspen Institute under Herbert Baer's stewardship some 30 years later sought to integrate the emerging corporate organizational networks with the behavioral psychology of good design, emerging information theory, and advanced consumerism through various forms of new media. It was precisely by bringing the broader range of thinkers, artists, and corporate leaders into one open and critical discussion about design as a social art that Aspen's yearly design conference proved instrumental in advancing the boundaries and intersection between commerce and culture in the 1950s. Baer was the architect for the entire Institute campus, buildings, landscape, and often events. And of equal importance, he was the father of the land art movement by combining landscape art and architecture into a singular construction and performance. His marble garden and land art are first to use the ground plane, the land, as organizational material for an earthwork, to cite Robert Smithson some years later. And last but not least, there's Phillip Johnson, whose life mantra was, "The only constant is change." Phillip Johnson, in his promulgation not only of different versions of modernism, but more importantly, his art of self-construction, i.e. his protean public persona, was focused and creative. Johnson was, of course, a master of media. The aesthetic play between history, society, good taste, and commerce was his playfield. His own house and property became an experimental laboratory not simply for the intersection of landscape art and architecture, but for his own self-production and history. As Johnson noted and enjoyed, he often became an effect of his own given and constructed representations. He actively engaged in a series of strategic and tactical language image games targeted at the cultural intersection between convention and spectacle. Understanding better than his contemporaries the paradoxical condition of modern subjectivity in late capitalism, Johnson artfully tested Benneman's thesis that devaluation of the world of objects by allegory is exceeded within the world of objects itself by commodity. Think about that one. Johnson understood the social critical logic of late capitalism, understood his status as a myth maker, much like Andy Warhol. As social icon, the architect engenders both social poetic production and its futility. The architect is expected to be simultaneously socially productive and critical. This is an economic and cultural game that cannot be won. It is all about how you play the game of represented ideas. Johnson plays the game masterfully, better than anyone of his generation. Again, I have much more to say, but time is already past due, and I'm sure Charles wants me to leave. Oops. Thank you.